Travel Through Grief. Welcome to Travel Through Grief. I'm Ellen Beckemeyer. Today is National Paper Airplane Day. Now, I realize that probably wasn't on your calendar. It wasn't exactly on mine either. When we think of those important days, we usually think of the holidays, the birthdays, the anniversaries, the celebrations, and especially those milestones. National Paper Airplane Day feels a little random, but then something happened this week that made me pay attention. I was watching the original Planet of the Apes movie yesterday, and there was a scene where Charlton Heston folds a paper airplane. The timing made me laugh because I was already preparing for this episode, and it struck me how rarely paper airplanes really do show up in the movies. Usually if they do, they're in a classroom, a student waiting for the bell, an office scene where somebody is pretending to pay attention while mentally planning their lunch. Paper airplanes are usually treated as distractions, but this time it wasn't. In Planet of the Apes, Taylor, played by Charlton Heston, folds the airplane because he's trying to communicate an idea. He launches it, the airplane glides, and then one of the apes picks it up, studies it briefly, and then crumples it. And I couldn't stop thinking about that tiny scene. Not because of the movie, but because of what the paper airplane represents. Now, normally it's a toy, but it's also something more. It's humanity's fascination with flight reduced to a single sheet of paper. It's imagination, experimentation, engineering, curiosity. It's a tiny flight. And perhaps that's why generations of children have loved them. Not because they're paper, but because they fly. Or at least they try to. Now think back to being a kid. You fold the paper, you make your best guess, then you throw it. Maybe it immediately dives into the floor. Mine always did. Maybe it leaps into a wall. Maybe it flies beautifully across the room. Whatever happens, you do learn something. Then you just try it again. Without realizing it, children are conducting experiments. They're changing the wings, adjusting the nose, changing the weight. Maybe they're just testing theories, but they are making observations. They're trying again. Most children don't know the word aerodynamics, yet they're exploring it anyway, through play. One of the most remarkable things about children is that they learn without realizing they're learning. A child doesn't sit down and say, "Today I shall study airflow." They just want the airplane to fly further than their friends. But in the process, they begin discovering principles that engineers and pilots care about. The balance, the symmetry, the weight, all the small adjustments, they matter. A tiny bend in one wing changes the entire flight path. And that's an interesting lesson, because life often works exactly the same way. Tiny adjustments can create very different outcomes. Just one conversation, decision, maybe an introduction, an opportunity, a question, and a trip. Sometimes the smallest change alters the direction of everything that follows. Now, humanity has always wanted to fly. What fascinates me is that paper airplanes connect us to something much older. Human beings have always been fascinated by flights, long before airports, aviation, even before the Wright brothers. People watched the birds and wondered, how do they do that? How do they leave the ground? How do they stay there? How do they travel such incredible distances? Imagine living your entire life in a world where no human had ever flown. No airplanes, helicopters, hot air balloons, nothing. Flight belonged exclusively to birds. Then imagine telling someone, one day people will cross oceans in giant metal machines carrying hundreds of passengers. You would sound ridiculous. And not to mention having peanuts in the middle of the air? Oh my. History is full of ideas that sounded impossible before they became ordinary. Flying machines, telephones, television, space travel, the internet. At some point, every invention existed only in imagination. Every invention began as a possibility. Every invention started as someone asking, what if? And perhaps that's what Taylor was demonstrating with the paper airplane. Not merely flight, but possibility. The idea that the world might be larger than what we currently understand. The willingness to imagine something beyond present experience. That's one of humanity's greatest strengths. We imagine first, then we build. And here's something I've been wondering about. When did adulthood become a performance review? Children experiment constantly. They try things, they fail, they try again. Nobody expects mastery. Nobody expects perfection. Nobody says, if you make this paper airplane, you better be committed to aviation for the rest of your life. But adults, they often treat new experiences very differently. One photography class becomes, what if I'm not good at it? One trip becomes, what if I waste all this money? One new hobby becomes, what if I quit? And one conversation becomes, what if it goes badly? It's as if every decision suddenly carries permanent consequences. And I understand why. Experience teaches caution. Responsibilities increase. Time becomes more valuable. Resources become more limited. But sometimes we accidentally apply commitment, thinking to situations that only require curiosity. Not everything is a life-changing decision. Some things are experiments. Some things are simply opportunities to gather information, to learn, discover, explore. You know, a paper airplane isn't a commitment. It's an experiment, you all. Let's see what happens. Then we'll decide what comes next. This is one reason I love travel. Travel temporarily restores curiosity. Now think about how differently people behave when they're traveling. Someone who always orders the same meal suddenly tries unfamiliar food. Someone who never walks around their own neighborhood spends 6 hours wandering through a city they've never visited. Someone who carefully plans every detail suddenly follows a recommendation from a stranger. And somehow, it just feels normal. Expected even. Travel changes the rules. At home, we seek certainty. While traveling, we expect discovery. We know we'll encounter unfamiliar things. The different food, customs, landscapes, perspectives. And that's exactly why we go. Nobody travels hoping everything feels exactly like yesterday. The attraction is the difference, the novelty, the possibility of encountering something unexpected. The interesting thing is that curiosity doesn't actually require a passport. You can be curious in your hometown. You can explore your own city. You can visit a museum you never visited, walk a trail you've never walked, attend an event you've never attended. Travel is often less about geography and more about attention. It's the willingness to see something new. Now, have you ever noticed that the best travel stories almost never begin with everything went exactly according to schedule? Nobody comes home excited about a perfectly executed itinerary, at least nobody I know. The stories people tell are different. The missed turn, the hidden cafe, the bookstore they discovered accidentally, the local festival they didn't know existed, and the conversation with a stranger, the unexpected detour, the scenic route that wasn't supposed to happen. And the moment those experiences often feel inconvenient, later they become memorable. And isn't it that interesting? We spend so much energy trying to eliminate uncertainty, yet uncertainty often produces the very stories we treasure the most. The same thing can happen in life. Many meaningful opportunities arrive disguised as detours. An unexpected introduction, a chance encounter, a wrong turn, a scheduled change, a conversation you weren't planning to have. At that time, they seem insignificant, maybe even annoying. Looking back, they become turning points. So let's blame Hollywood for a moment. Movies have trained us to expect dramatic transformation, the breakthrough moment, the victory speech, the grand realization, the triumphant ending. The credits roll. Life changed. But if you pay attention, many great movies tell a different story. Now take The Karate Kid. Everyone remembers the crane kick. Almost nobody talks about how much the movie involves repetitive practice outside of wax on, wax off. But do we talk about how he had to paint the fence? Do we talk about how he had to sand the floor? At first it appears pointless, boring even. Daniel doesn't understand the purpose. The audience isn't entirely sure either. Then eventually the lesson does reveal itself. What fascinates me is that the transformation didn't happen during the crane kick. The transformation happened during the repetition. The payoff simply made it visible. And of course, a good soundtrack doesn't hurt. Life often works exactly the same way. Growth rarely announces itself. The walk doesn't feel transformational. The class doesn't. The conversation doesn't. The repetition doesn't. And then one day you realize you're different. Not because of one giant moment, but because of the many small moments. Those many tiny flights. I've often thought about the difference between observing life and participating in it. I've always loved stories, movies, history. And then there's the patterns, the connections, the memories. There is a tremendous value in observation. Every family needs someone who remembers. Every generation needs storytellers. Every community needs historians. Observers notice things. They preserve the things. They connect the dots others miss. But there comes a moment when every observer faces an interesting question. What story are you creating? Not documenting, creating. What memories are still ahead of you? What experiences remain unexplored? What chapters remain unwritten? Travel asks us to become participants, not merely witnesses. You can read about Paris or walk through Paris. You can watch the documentaries about the oceans or stand beside one, and if you're lucky, even in one. You can learn about places or start experiencing them. Both have value, but they are not the same thing. The paper airplane reminds me of that distinction. It's not enough to imagine flight. Eventually, the airplane has to leave your hand. And this is why I think paper airplanes beat the jumbo jets. Here's the heart of today's episode. When people think about change, they usually imagine jumbo jets when it comes to travel. Massive breakthroughs, major transformations, completely different lives, huge outcomes. But nobody starts with a jumbo jet, not the pilot, engineers, not the inventors, the travelers, not even the children. The first flight is small. It's a paper airplane, a kite, a glider, a short hop. Something simple, experimental, imperfect. And maybe that's the mistake many of us make. We think our next chapter has to begin dramatically. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it begins with something much smaller. That conversation or class, that photograph, a day trip, a friendship, a question, a possibility, a tiny flight. So let me leave you with a question. What tiny flight is available to you this week? Not a complete life overhaul, not a 5-year plan, not even a major reinvention, just a small experiment. Maybe it is taking a different route home. Maybe it's visiting somewhere you've never been. Maybe it's learning something new this week. Maybe it's attending that event or creating something. And what I've learned this year through my friend Susan Hyatt, maybe it's saying yes to an invitation. Maybe it's making one phone call that you've been postponing. Not because you're certain where it leads, but because you're curious enough to find out. Because discovery requires movement. The beautiful thing about paper airplanes is that nobody expects perfection. You fold the paper, you launch it, you observe, you learn, you adjust, and then you just try again. Children understand this instinctively, you all. Adults sometimes need that reminding. Not every meaningful journey begins with a jumbo jet crossing an ocean. Sometimes it begins with a sheet of paper. So with just a little imagination, a willingness to experiment and explore and discover what happens when something leaves the ground. And perhaps that's the invitation hidden inside National Paper Airplane Day. Not the perfection, not the certainty, but the curiosity, one tiny flight at a time. I'm Ellen Beckemeyer, and this is Travel Through Grief. Until next time, I want you to keep exploring, keep growing, and keep finding your way. If this episode connected with you, I'd love for you to follow our podcast, leave a review, or share it with someone who may need it. Those small actions truly help new podcasts like Travel Through Grief grow and reach more people. And thank you to everyone who has already listened, rated, reviewed, and supported this journey. I appreciate you more than you know. Until next time, keep finding your way forward.